Well, the S&P 500 and NASDAQ both hit new record highs earlier today, led by news of the trade deal between the U.S. and China. But the numbers closed mixed after the president pulled the plug on trade talks with Canada.
A quiet storm is hitting America's farming heartland, and what began as a few canceled contracts has now turned into a full-scale collapse in wheat shipments. Buyers who once saw American wheat as a symbol of quality and reliability are walking away, not because of price, but because trust has eroded. For many farmers already feeling financial pressure, the fear is real. The loss of another generation of farmers could be next. There was a time when American wheat was considered untouchable, the backbone of the global food economy, shipped to Manila, Marseille, Tokyo, and beyond. It was not just a product, but a promise of consistency and stability. That promise has now been broken. What is happening is not a temporary slump or a seasonal hiccup, but a silent erosion of trust in one of America's most iconic exports. Countries that once relied heavily on U.S. wheat are now shifting quietly, not with protests, but with new contracts signed elsewhere, signaling a massive shift in the global grain trade. The collapse did not announce itself with headlines, but arrived with canceled orders, unrenewed contracts, empty silos, and in some desperate cases, fields burned because there was nowhere to sell the harvest.
Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
And we're going to lose another generation of farmers.
The first signs appeared in the Philippines, a country that had consumed around 3 million tons of wheat annually, 90% of it sourced from the United States. It was a market American farmers believed was secure, a constant in a volatile world. But in May 2025, the collapse began when a top milling firm canceled 12,000 tons of U.S. wheat with no renegotiation or delay. Instead, they signed a new contract for 110,000 tons of wheat sourced from Canada and Australia. Price was not the problem. U.S. wheat was cheaper by $8 to $10 per ton, but stability and predictability mattered more.
Now, it seems the strong U.S. dollar is shredding the country's agricultural exports. It's a double whammy as well for farmers in the U.S. already suffering from a collapse in prices and weaker demand.
Reports from the Philippines revealed the underlying reasons. American wheat was seen as risky, unpredictable, and vulnerable to political disruptions from Washington. Each ton carried hidden costs in the form of insurance premiums, shipment delays, and the risk of sudden cancellations tied to policy disputes. As these risks became more evident, the dominoes fell quickly. Inland U.S. ports slowed. Inventories rose in top wheat-producing states like North Dakota, Kansas, and Nebraska, and freight trains waiting to load wheat had nowhere to go. Labor shortages worsened the problem, with immigrant workers leaving due to new restrictions, causing harvests to remain unfinished, and in some cases, leading farmers to burn unsellable crops in their fields.
Farming more than 4,000 acres of soybean and corn and winter wheat on his family farm.
Meanwhile, in the Philippines, bakery shelves stayed stocked with bread made from Canadian and Australian grain. The price of pandesal rose by over 11% when American supply faltered but stabilized when Canadian shipments arrived on time. There were no protests or celebrations, just a quiet transition, a victory for someone else, and the Philippines was only the beginning. In France, where bread is integral to culture, another shift unfolded. For decades, France had sourced premium hard wheat from the American Midwest to produce baguettes and croissants, relying on the consistency of U.S. wheat. But in 2025, imports from the U.S. dropped to their lowest in over 20 years, as French milling companies signed new agreements with Canadian suppliers or returned to domestic wheat, despite weather-related challenges. The reasons were clear. American shipments faced delays, high carbon scores, and exceeded chemical residue thresholds. Importers also faced uncertainty about whether shipments would clear customs, with risks of delays or cancellations due to sudden policy changes in Washington. This uncertainty made American wheat too risky, leading buyers to quietly stop placing orders, collapsing a century-old trade route without a sound. Kansas milling co-ops scaled back, delayed harvests, and shelved expansion plans, while tons of wheat sat idle. Canadian exports to the EU rose by over 40% compared to 2024, with France leading the shift. Canadian farms equipped with smart harvesters, moisture monitoring, and digital supply chain integration offered precise protein content and fast delivery, while American suppliers struggled to adapt. The The result was a smooth transition for French consumers, with bread tasting the same, but the supplier having changed.
Well, flooding in British Columbia continues to take a toll on ag in that region. Among the many challenges facing impacted residents are hurdles to the transportation system.
In South Korea, the story was similar. For nearly 4 decades, the U.S. was South Korea's top wheat supplier, with American wheat used in instant noodles and packaged bread. This was a stable, practical trade relationship until it wasn't. Between late 2024 and mid-2025, U.S. market share collapsed from over 35% to below 17%, while Canada's share surged to over 60%. The reason was stricter glyphosate residue limits in South Korea, with U.S. wheat regularly testing above recommended levels, while Canadian and Australian wheat met the lower thresholds. For Korean importers, the choice was clear. They could choose predictable, pre-certified Canadian shipments over risky American wheat, which came with extra insurance and testing costs. By June, U.S. wheat disappeared from South Korean ports as Canadian shipments arrived consistently, and American flour was no longer discussed in boardrooms of major Korean food manufacturers.
Well, new this midday, the Canadian province of Ontario announced a 25% electricity surcharge to the U.S. This is in response to President Trump's 25% tariff on imports from Canada. Mexico faces similar tariffs, which are expected to start in the coming weeks. Yesterday, Canada elected its new prime minister. In his acceptance speech, Liberal leader Mark Carney called this moment a crisis to the South.
Back in the U.S., inventories surged by 36% in Washington state, and farmers in Idaho switched to flaxseed to adapt. Long-term contracts disappeared, and while there were no protests, the silence was deafening. Then came the blow from Mexico, which stung even more because it came from a neighbor and partner. Historically, one of the top 3 buyers of American wheat, Mexico imported over 3 million tons annually. By mid-2025, imports of American wheat had dropped nearly 40%, while imports from Canada rose over 35%, with Argentina emerging as a new supplier. The reason was frustration with last-minute rule changes, inconsistent export documentation, and tariff fluctuations, making shipments unreliable and causing delays that triggered production halts and food price spikes. Canadian wheat, on the other hand, was predictable, with timely arrivals and clean paperwork. By the second quarter of 2025, Canadian wheat exports to Mexico jumped 37%, while U.S. farmers in Arizona and Texas slashed prices by 20% to clear inventory, yet orders still went north. Finally, the silent shift reached Italy, the global heart of pasta. Italy had long sourced premium durum wheat from the U.S., but by 2025, Canada held 45% of Italy's wheat import market, while the U.S. had dropped to just 15%. The reason was not failure on the part of American farmers, but Canada's ability to adapt. Canadian suppliers developed new durum wheat varieties with improved elasticity and integrated real-time logistics with inspections, delivering exactly what Italian pasta factories needed. For Italy, this was not just about quality, but about respect and reliability. As the U.S. adjusted policies, Canada adjusted its protein content, and it worked. American wheat disappeared quietly from Italy, replaced by consistent Canadian shipments without protests or trade wars. This is the story of 2025, not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet, relentless shift in global wheat markets. The Philippines, France, South Korea, Mexico, and Italy, all longtime customers of American wheat, have moved on, not because of price, but because of trust. Canada is not cheaper, it is more predictable, and in a world defined by uncertainty, predictability is everything. What happens next for the United States depends on whether it can adapt. Rebuilding the wheat trade empire will require changes not just in price, but in consistency, communication, and stability. Local businesses that depend on the income of wheat farmers, from equipment suppliers to diners and schools funded by farm tax revenues, are beginning to feel the strain. As contracts vanish and silos overflow, farmers are forced to cut back on spending, halt equipment upgrades, and in some cases, abandon farmland altogether. Communities that once thrived on the reliability of the wheat trade now face an uncertain future, with young people leaving for cities as opportunities dwindle, threatening to hollow out America's agricultural heartland. This is not just a trade issue, it is a societal one, testing the resilience of small towns and the identity of farming families who have fed the world for generations.